Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you, Lionel, for organizing this Pembroke session on reading, writing, and mentoring in what are certainly tough times for all of us, for our families, and for the entire world. I think it speaks really about the value that teachers place on learning, that so many of you have made time to show up here today to learn a little bit alongside Larry, Adrian, and myself. So thank you very much for the time that you're making for us today. When I talk about the culture of learning, this is actually what spurred the book that my co-author and I, Diane Vetter, began this journey with. We were looking at the many relationships in education that constitute a mentoring relationship. And what we recognized was that oftentimes mentoring was a term that might be reserved for programs or people in position of official big L leadership. And when we took a step back and we looked at the culture of teaching and learning in schools, we realized that teachers actually work informally and relationally with one another in mentoring capacities all over the place. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to take an opportunity to honor the work that teachers do in mentoring, to bring some structure and some opportunity for fulsome conversation to that space, and to also recognize the fact that many of us are mentoring on the fly, which is a reality when we are working with restricted timeframes. And also what I want to say before I get into the talk a little bit more is that I think that with the current situation, with so many of us working from home and working virtually across classrooms, mentoring and this relational aspect of being together and supporting one another and supporting one another's professional practice is really important. And so I'm hoping that you'll find some things in both the talk today and in the text that might help you, whether you consider yourself in some official capacity as a mentor or whether it's work that you do more informally. So to that end, I want to take a moment to invite you to take a little step back in your own mind's eye and to think about a mentoring relationship that you've had that's had an impact on your professional practice. So when you think about your work and your responsibility as a teacher and the journey that you've been on, I want you to think about one mentoring relationship that meant something to you. Who was your mentor? What made that relationship spring to mind when I invited you to think about it just now? What did you learn from each other? And lastly, what's one trait you would like to bring forward with you into your future mentoring partnerships? So I'd ask you to just hold that memory in mind of an important mentoring relationship as we go through the presentation today. And what I'm hoping to do is to tell you a little bit about how this book is set up. I'm going to take you through some highlights, which is kind of a chapter by chapter breakdown. I want to talk a little bit about who is a mentor, because I think that there are some misconceptions that we have to wait till someone in our district or our school board tells us that we're a mentor in order to really feel that that's part of our traditional role, when so many of us are doing the work anyway. So we'll talk a little bit about who is a mentor and where the opportunities exist in education for mentoring. And then I want to spend some time talking about what characterizes a productive mentoring relationship. I'm going to close the presentation today by delving into something called a mentoring move, which will make a little bit more sense when we get there. And I'm going to talk about a mentoring move in action, and I'm going to pay a little bit of homage to Larry's book in that section to demonstrate how this could be used as a professional learning tool. So the Mentoring Each Other text really wanted to put together 5 different chapters that could be read across the chapters or could be taken individually, bearing in mind that people sometimes don't have time to make it through a whole text. So the first chapter really addresses the mentoring partnership. So what happens when two people come together to learn from each other? What are some of the traditional concepts associated with mentoring, including the power hierarchy that's sometimes associated, and what can we do to deconstruct some of that to have a more productive relationship? Our second chapter addresses some of the more commonplace knowledge and skills that mentors can draw on in their relationship, and that includes some strategies and some approaches that you could try out. The third chapter takes us through something that we've called reciprocal learning. And essentially that's sort of a way of positioning ourselves to being open and to being vulnerable, to learning from one another, which is sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. You know, it picks up on that same sense of discomfort that Larry was talking about earlier in talking about tough topics, because it asks us in much the same way to be vulnerable with each other when we open ourselves to not just being the mentor or the traditional holder of the knowledge, but we open ourselves to being in a reciprocal relationship where we learn from one another. The fourth chapter talks about mentoring as leadership and how our mentoring relationships, whether they are formal or informal, can be really a launching point for big L or small L leadership opportunities in our schools, in our grade teams, and across our communities, especially when we're doing work to advance equitable outcomes for all students. Anything that we can do to amplify the scope of our voice becomes really important. So my co-author and I wanted to spend some time talking about how to mobilize some of the work that you might be doing in your mentoring partnership. So we have chapter 4, mentoring as leadership, and then we close the book with an additional way of thinking about mentoring, which is to create mentoring communities. And I think that historically we've conceptualized mentoring as being between two people. And my partner and I, Diane, when we were doing some of our research, what we discovered was that when we bring people together in groups, especially when we brought mentor pairs, a mentor and a mentee together with another mentor and a mentee, the learning and the sense of excitement was so contagious, really exponential. And so what we wanted to do was spend some time to think about, you know, if you are in a mentoring relationship, or if you're in a school that has, or a district that has a program, how could it look to build a community from this space as opposed to just retaining the sort of partnership aspect? So that's kind of an overview of the book and some of the key ideas. What I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about where are the opportunities for mentorship. So you've already got some ideas in mind because you're considering that historical mentoring relationship that was special to you. In Canada, from province to province, we have different kinds of mentoring opportunities and programs depending on the ministries of education involved in the school boards. But for example, here in Ontario, we have a program called the New Teacher Induction Program. And that's a program that's designed for teachers who are newly hired to the board in their first year or two, and they are paired up formally with a mentor. I think other districts and other provinces may have programs that call it something slightly different, but it's a formal program. It gives you the title of mentorship. There's generally some professional learning that goes along with it, which is wonderful. Another opportunity might be to become an associate teacher or a host teacher. And many of you who have been working in education for some time might have been associate or host teachers in the past, which is when you bring a teacher candidate from a faculty of education into your classroom and you give them an opportunity to sort of stretch their wings a little bit. And your mentorship work in that space, of course, is incredibly important because it helps the students to make a transition from theory into practice. We also have mentoring opportunities if we're acting as coaches or administrators in our districts or our school boards. But most importantly, you know, are those informal partnerships, the ones that happen with our colleague who's across the hall. When we start in a new school community sometimes and someone reaches out to us and says, you know, call me anytime if you want to chat about this. And I think that those are the sometimes unrecognized relationships of mentoring that could also benefit from some professional learning, from some structure, and from some attention. So I also want to talk about when we're thinking about being a mentor. Diane, my colleague, and I, who wrote this book, we think about what is a mentoring disposition. Sometimes it's really easy to get in the weeds about how to do something correctly. Our book is not about right and wrong or correctly. It's about how to explore some of the value of our personal experiences, our narratives. Larry mentioned that personal narrative is a gift. It absolutely is, and it's a gift in mentoring as well. So we think about mentoring less about formal practices and more about dispositions. So thinking about yourself as somebody who's open to honest self-reflection, open to listening and sharing. And this is an important one, willing to make your professional practice public. That's a hard one. Not just to open your classroom or to share your resources, but to start to articulate why you do the things you do, why they're of value to you, and how they fit with your personal story and your identity as an educator. And as someone, and finally, mentoring disposition as someone who collaborates in partnerships and across communities. So what we're hoping for here is that you don't need to situate yourself as being an expert in the field. You don't need to have X number of years of teaching behind you in order to consider yourself a mentor. It's more about a disposition or a mindset that you can bring to a reciprocal learning kind of partnership, right? So anyone can be a mentor, and many of you, in fact, I'm pretty confident that all of you have served in some mentoring capacity, whether you know it or not. When I ask this question of teachers and teacher candidates for them to think about a mentoring relationship, sometimes the stories that they'll share are that their mentors are people who might not even know that they were serving as mentors at the time. They were kind of watching them from a distance and asking them questions. So anyone can be a mentor. And I think as we move through this challenging period where we're kind of distanced from each other, that mentoring relationship can really do a lot to support your colleagues and to offer yourself some space to talk about not just your practice, but some of the struggles that are happening day to day as we try and serve our various communities and reach out to our students. So if we talk about a mentoring disposition, one of the other things I wanted to mention was in our chapter on reciprocal learning, we talk about what characterizes a productive mentoring relationship. And I think what we're hoping for here is that we can start to think of a mentoring relationship as something that's transitioning away from traditional power dynamics. One of the anecdotes that came about in our research, we had a lovely teacher who attended our professional development sessions and was talking about how she was serving as a host teacher and how on Tuesdays her teacher candidate came into her classroom and was there with her for the whole day. And she said, I have to be perfect on Tuesdays. I have to make sure that I'm really prepared ahead of time, that I'm putting my best foot forward, that I'm really showing the most polished elements of my practice. And that to us, when we think about that, we think about how much pressure is involved in that situation. And we don't want mentoring to be a pressure-filled situation. We want it to be a rewarding one. So we are encouraging our mentors and our mentoring relationships to step back from that traditional hierarchy and the traditional power dynamic. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have a flawless practice of 20 years in order to serve in a mentoring relationship. We think of it as being more responsive to one another's needs. How can you understand what someone is hoping to learn and take away from an experience, and how can you explore that together? One of the other things that we think about is how to aim for mutual growth, so that a mentoring relationship isn't just about your mentee's growth, but also about your own. And that means that you take some risks together. It might mean that you're negotiating differences. Anybody who's been in a mentoring relationship will encounter some difference, whether it's in what you value, in what you believe to be important about education, in how you manage a classroom, what resources you choose. And sometimes that can be really, really frustrating. Many of us in mentoring relationships don't understand what drives the other educator who we're trying to mentor. And so what we try to do in our book is we try to make opportunities for really clear-cut conversations about why we might make the decisions we make, where our values come from, and how to explore co-learning together. And that actually brings me to how our chapters are set up. So what we wanted to do, in recognition of the fact that stories matter, and telling our stories is a really important foundational tool for establishing a relationship with one another. So in each of our chapters, we share what we call stories from the field. And they're stories that Diane and I have either experienced personally as teachers, or they're stories that our cohorts have shared with us that explore the mentoring relationship and some of the challenges. In addition to stories from the field, our chapters focus on skills, strategies, approaches that you can use in order to improve the relationship, which is the foundation of mentoring. And we also, in each chapter, have 4 or 5 mentoring moves. And the mentoring moves are really, if I'm being honest, the heart and soul of the book. The mentoring moves are black line masters that teachers can use, coaches can use, even administrators might want to use them in staff meetings right away with your partners, with your teams. The mentoring moves are really conversation starters. In some cases, they might be exercises that you can do together. We recognize the time constraints, so we try to make it so that if there's something specific that you're hoping to achieve with someone you're mentoring, that you can have a quick look through the mentoring moves in the book and maybe find a support so that you're not starting from scratch, so that you have a third point in your conversation to anchor it and to build from. Oftentimes when we're mentoring, it can feel as if we're circling one another when we're talking about what is at the heart of the issue, or we're having these conversations on the fly. You can see on the cover of our book, we've got 2 people walking down the hallway and talking to each other. So what's really important is, even if it's a 10-minute mentoring conversation, we want it to have some meaning, some purpose, some value for you, so that there's something that you can anchor your conversation in, and it's not just simply an exchange of resources or a pressure-filled response where you feel like you have to come up with the right answer for your mentee. These mentoring moves, so as I said, recognize that time is limited. They provide structure to the conversations. They take advantage of some proven mentoring knowledge and skills that exist in the field. And they're about you and your partner or your community working together. And lastly, they're for all stages of a relationship. So many of us start a mentoring relationship, and our needs at the beginning of a relationship might be different than as the relationship progresses and advances over the years. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to meet the needs of mentors as you journey with your mentee through the years. Maybe you need a mentoring move about values and what you value in education as a starting point. And maybe you need something else, something that explores professional learning together as you get further along in your partnership, right? So we wanted to recognize that and provide you with adequate opportunities to transition through your relationship with these mentoring moves. So what I'll do right now is I'll talk about a mentoring move in action. And Lionel, if you'd be kind enough to post that as a handout. Diane and I are providing a mentoring move here. So this is an example of a black line master. In the book, what will happen is you'll have an introduction, 3 simple steps that will talk about how this black line master can be used with a mentee, with a mentor, if it's the mentee that has the book, or with a community of mentors and mentees, right? So for example, here you'll see that this is about inquiring collaboratively. So this is for a relationship where maybe you've been working together for a few weeks or a couple of months or maybe even a year, and you're ready to do some kind of really focused co-learning. And so what we're saying here is the mentors and mentees can choose a topic of mutual interest. So maybe you're thinking, how am I going to teach online in the fall? I've got my unit. I want to look at exploring some educational technology that can help me be more interactive. So maybe you and your mentee want to explore that together. And then you turn to the Inquiring Collaboratively template, and each of you would complete really point form notes on one particular resource that you think can help you along in your journey answering that question. And then you come back together and you share with one another. It's as simple as that. But what you can see happening here is that even if it's 15 minutes that you take to meet with each other once a week, this provides meaning, purpose, structure, so that you're not just meeting and saying, hey, how's it going? Do you need help with something? Which is a hard question to answer. This gives you something to work with. So the last thing I've done here is I have completed an Inquiring Collaboratively based on Larry's wonderful text, just to show you how this might look. So let's say that my mentee and I were talking earlier in the week, and we were thinking about how important some of these tough conversations can be in the classroom. And we said, we really need to find some resources to help us along. I might turn to Larry's book, and my mentee might turn to a totally different resource, and that's fine. And I might ask some questions of Larry's book to help me understand it and to help me share it with my mentee. So you can see here that I've read through Larry's book, and I've said, okay, so for me, the key message is that social justice and equity is an integral responsibility. I want to share a few details of the book with my colleague. I've picked a quote as one of the members of the partnership that can support our dynamic conversation that we're going to have to follow up. I've posed a question that I think my mentee and I can talk about in reference to the text. And I've made a note here for implications for practice. So as I read through Larry's book, I'm thinking about what my mentee and I are hoping to do in our classrooms in the fall. And I'm saying, you know what? What about this? And so when my mentee and I come together, whether it's 15 minutes or half an hour, or we're having virtual coffee, I can say, hey, okay, let's talk about this resource. Here are some things that I found. And this is just one example of how we can add some purpose and some structure and some sort of meaning without putting a whole lot of pressure on ourselves to be the knower, to be the perfect teacher, to be the person who has a flawless and polished practice, because that's not who we are. That's not what we're advocating for. We want to recognize that learning is an ongoing journey. You're all here today because you believe that, and you're providing evidence of that by giving your time, right? So our approach to mentoring is really rooted in that equitable relationship, that deconstructed power hierarchy, and that belief that lifelong learning is at the root of what we all do each and every day as teachers. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I'll say thank you so much. I don't think that this link is live. It was live, but Lionel has been kind enough to provide it in the chat. I'm really looking forward to engaging with any questions that you may have once we conclude all of the webinars. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, thanks, Lana. And while Adrian is getting set up here, there is one question that came through. Was the mentoring part of your PhD, or is that something that came later in your academic career?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The mentoring actually was like a parenthesis. It was there in my professional practice. So as an educator in Ontario, I was working with the NTIP program.
Right.
My school district had a program called Mentor Leadership. So I was attending a lot of professional development, and I was coaching other mentors in the district. And then it became part of my postdoctoral research. So it wasn't part of my PhD, but it's certainly very important to the work that I do when I think about equity, because relationships are what I really study. And to me, this is one of the most important relationships we have.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Great. Well, there's lots of people in the chat saying thank you, Lana. So thank you very much. That's great.